Everyone, and welcome to this week's installment of the Huron Pines Connecting to Nature series. We're excited to spend the next 30 minutes learning with you. At Huron Pines, we work to conserve and enhance Northern Michigan's natural resources. Focused in three primary program areas, healthy water, protected places, and vibrant communities, our staff implement projects from river restoration and green infrastructure to protecting special places forever and controlling invasive species populations. If you're not familiar with our work, we encourage you to get to know us. I'm MI Vogelgesang, Huron Pines Environmental Education Coordinator. Jen Klemm, a Huron Pines AmeriCorps member serving at Huron Pines, will be leading a great conversation today. Before we dive into that, I have just a couple of quick housekeeping items. Please make use of the chat box to respond to questions. You'll see them bolded on the slides, or ask questions of your own today. Everyone will remain muted for the rest of the program. Your video was turned off when you entered the room. Please know that if you turn it back on, all participants can see you. If you experience technical difficulties, Chris Engel, our communications associate, is available in the chat by email or phone. We will also be recording this installment, so if you lose connection, you can watch it later. Herbicides and the use of chemicals are an important part of the conversation around invasive species. Please note that there are specific legal and permitting requirements associated with chemical treatments, especially near bodies of water. If you're utilizing any management techniques, please make sure you're following all legal and permitting requirements for your area. Finally, I want to acknowledge the incredible funders who support the Huron Pines Education Program. The Great Lakes Fishery Trust, Consumers Energy Foundation, the U.S. Forest Service, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, the U.S. Endowment for Forests and Communities through the Healthy Watersheds Consortium Program, and individual donors and supporters like you. And with that, I'm going to let Jen introduce herself, and then we'll get into today's topic.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Emily, for such a great introduction, as always. As she said, I'm Jen. I'm serving with the Huron Pines AmeriCorps as part of my VISTA service through Michigan Tech, where I'm pursuing my master's in applied ecology. So this is a really big topic that we're going to be diving into in kind of a little bite-sized session, so please bear with us. We'll try and answer as many of your questions as we can surrounding the topics that we're covering. But we're going to be talking about what are invasive species, some tips for spotting them, how to prevent them, overviewing a couple of the management techniques, and then talking about some of the more common invasive species that we find in Northern Michigan. And then ending with an activity per usual and Q&A. So if we want to dive right in, we can.
Yeah, let's get going. What are invasive species? How are we defining that today?
Right. So we have two definitions here on screen, and essentially what the common thread is between both of them is that invasive species are species which cause harm as non-natives, right? We have hundreds and hundreds of non-native naturalized species in Michigan, and all over really, right? At this point, we're a global economy, we're a global world. And so when we're thinking about what an invasive species is, though, it's one that's non-native but also is causing harm, especially in the three categories of economic harm, environmental ecological harm, and then human health hazards. So kind of thinking of those and thinking of invasive species that you guys might know, does anyone in the chat have a favorite invasive species or a least favorite invasive, as it were?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we think about those harm, that word harm, right? And sort of being able to really get specific of the difference between a non-native and an invasive is just in that harm. And for me, at least, the invasive species I find, I guess, most insane is how I would probably put it, is Japanese knotweed. And I know we're going to talk about that a little later, but and we're hearing someone else say Japanese knotweed is favorite. It is the strength of that plant is pretty insane. We're hearing Phragmites, definitely a common one that is on the forefront of our minds, particularly around our coastal areas. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. So when we're thinking about how invasives can even, how they can outcompete our native species, right? Because they're not native, they aren't from here. So theoretically, right, they shouldn't even be able to stand up against native species.
Right.
And just for reference, today we're going to be covering more forest invasive species. So as much as we would love to cover ones surrounding riparian areas and other plant species and animals and all that, we just don't have the time for it today. So all of these different strategies are going to be focused on the forest ecosystems. So just keeping that in mind too. So when we're thinking about the way that they function for competition, they function by using adaptability. So having distinct preferences for disturbed areas. So especially anthropogenic caused events, like after, say, logging or buildings being torn down or things like that. They also typically have more aggressive root systems than their native counterparts. Thinking back to when we talked about native plants and we showed kind of some of those images of just how much variety are in root systems, right? Typically when we're looking at invasive species, they have far more dense root systems, so things can't really grow around them. Oftentimes, like with spotted knapweed and garlic mustard, they use allelopathy, which is essentially they're poisoning the soil for anything that isn't them. And then a lot of times you see rhizomes as well, or runners, as they can be called, or kind of different, but botanic speaking. And so they have these different strategies that help them compete from a root standpoint, and then just basic reproduction, right? Fragmentation. So if you don't get every single piece of them, every little leaf, every little stem, they can just clonally reproduce using those. And then having increased seed production. So whereas a native species might produce, 20 to 100 seeds, sometimes you can get a single invasive plant producing hundreds or thousands of seeds, depending on what they are. So just kind of looking at that scale is pretty incredible.
Yeah, so they're out competing our natives, here in the state of Michigan, and we've all seen those impacts. What does it look like though, where something like a spotted knapweed or Japanese knotweed, where they're native to, right? They're native somewhere. Why do they do these crazy things there, or is there a difference in what you might see in their native habitats?
Yeah, that's great. And that's always one of the tricky things when we're thinking about invasives, because it's like, yeah, they do come from somewhere, right? And they're not wrecking the whole world, right? Japanese knotweed isn't tearing up buildings all over. And generally that's just because of natural checks and balances, right? Coevolution within an area. So usually there is a predator-prey relationship and they are the prey somewhere. We tend to think of that more when we think of animals, right? And invasive animals, but it definitely is the same with plants. So usually there are things that are eating them in their native habitats, or there are specific insects targeting them. And then we tend to try and correct that by bringing some of those over, and then that's other control methods. But yeah, so just those checks and balances that exist in their native habitats.
Gotcha. So how do we even start to find these and identify them and know that they're in our area?
So when we're thinking especially about plants, right, a lot of the invasive species that we see came over as ornamentals. So people were planting them in their yards as either food or decorative pieces, and so they have traits resembling those. So a lot of times they tend to hold on to their leaves longer than native plants, which means they're staying green longer, which means you can walk through a forest and see something like Japanese barberry or Norway maple, and it looks, pretty lush in comparison to a lot of other things that have already had die-off, or, for the fall. And then oftentimes you can spot them by different diseases that affect certain species. So on the left, we have a beautiful picture of tar spot fungus on a Norway maple, which doesn't affect sugar maples. And the leaves, when you're looking at a single tree, can be really hard to differentiate between sugar maples and Norway maples. So looking for that tar spot fungus is a really, really good indicator that you're seeing an invasive species as opposed to just a normal, happy, beautiful sugar maple.
Okay, so this type of thing is likely, or could be, a disease that was maybe present in Michigan, but sugar maples have a defense mechanism against it, and when Norway maples come onto the landscape, the disease might have already been present in there, then it's latching onto a species that doesn't have the defense against it. Is that sort of What's
Yeah, it could be that. It could have come over from wherever they're native to. There's a whole lot of reasons why these things can happen, but
Gotcha. Okay.
it's handy when it comes to not invasives for sure.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned sort of this landscaping and how some of our forest invasive species have come from that. What are we doing, or what can we do to even prevent these issues from arising, or is it sort of, it is what it is at this point, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so one of the biggest ways that we can prevent invasives from even entering an area is to practice decontamination. And in the take-home notes that Chris will be sending out after this lesson, we'll have a step-by-step guide on how to make your own decontamination kit and some ways to actually decontaminate your gear. But so if you're going hiking in one trail in southern Michigan, right, and then you come back up to northern Michigan and you don't wash your boots, you wear the same jackets, you have the same trail packs, what can end up happening is you can end up carrying seeds from those invasive species up to a trail in which they weren't present in, which is why things like boot brushes that we're starting to see more and more on trails are so handy, because they actually, according to the research, are helpful at preventing that spread. So just making sure to wash your gear is really a simple thing, but something that I know a lot of us forget to do or don't necessarily want to take that extra 5 minutes, 10 minutes to do, but it's really, really key. Also choosing native or naturalized plants when planting for your own personal gardens is really key, because again, a lot of these start as ornamentals like Japanese barberry, right? And then birds oftentimes will eat the seeds of these ornamental plants and then take them into forest areas because they're birds and that's what they do,
Right.
and then we end up with those in our forest ecosystems where they shouldn't be and where we aren't looking for them to be.
Right.
And kind of going hand in hand with that too, when we're thinking of what we want to plant, you don't always have to choose native or naturalized. I know there are lots of exotic varieties that I personally love when planting. But just making sure that you know what you're planting. Obviously, you're probably not going to be able to plant a high-risk invasive species, but definitely the low priority ones like barberry, right, are really, really common and really, really accessible, but maybe not the best choice. And so the Huron Pines Invasives page has some really good swaps that you can make too, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But yeah, there are a lot of really good native or naturalized plants that you can choose.
Right. Okay. So if we're here talking about invasive species, they're here. I think folks are on the call because they are cognizant of them. And what happens when these prevention measures don't work? How do we deal with invasives once they're in a place?
Right. And so there are a lot of different management strategies, and realistically, it's best to consult professionals when dealing with any particular thing, because each species is so unique, and its patterns of reproduction, its patterns of root growth, how you need to get it out of there is so varied that you can't just say like, oh, we'll just set fire to everything that we see, right? Because that might work for one, but not so much for another. So realistically, when you're thinking about these management, always talk to a professional when you're looking to implement it. But one of the biggest things is understanding what you're looking at, right? So understanding how it spreads, how it reproduces. Then there are several control techniques that you can utilize. So again, like decontamination, those prevention methods, some things for eradication. For more simple ones like garlic mustard to some extent, and horsetail to some extent, right? Like hand pulling is a very viable option. Other ones you can kind of cut down. Other ones need intensive herbicide application, which again should only happen if you're a professional. Fire can be a really, really great control, but you should always be careful when using fire. And then biological controls. So I know like goats and sheep are really great in an area. If you just want to let them go to town, they'll just eat everything down and it's fantastic. And then making sure that you're disposing of them properly. So especially with things that utilize fragmentation, you don't want to leave anything behind, right? You don't want to just like throw it in a trash bag, see the trash bag has holes, and then just kind of walk around, right? and drop it everywhere, because you could end up spreading it far beyond the reach of where you just eradicated it from.
Okay.
So,
gotcha. So when we're working to understand that invader, and it seems like that's something that would be just incredibly time intensive, right? Like how we've been researching our native plants for a very long time now, and what is from, I know you've spent some time researching plants in a lot of different ways. What does that even look like, right? How do we even begin to understand these species?
Yeah, so realistically, just kind of going to the notes that botanists have made, that professional forest managers have made on them, are key. And so here in Michigan, we have several common invasive species, and less common too, but ones that we often will see out and about. And so really you take it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
And so when we're looking at some of the common Michigan invasives that we tend to see in our forest ecosystems and prairie ecosystems, autumn olive is one of the big ones. So it is typically a shrub or a tree that grows up to 20 feet tall, and it has really beautiful gray-green foliage and really pretty flowers, but it does cause harm ecologically by creating these really dense monocultures that just kind of starve everything in the understory of light, which means that smaller saplings can't grow up, which means that we end up with these monocultures, right? Instead of going out into the forest and seeing lovely oaks and ash and maple, we end up with just autumn olive. And then it has seeds that are spread by birds, wildlife, and humans through the course of just movement around, right?
Right.
So
when you say monoculture, can you talk about what that means a little bit more?
Yeah, so a monoculture, we often see it in the agricultural industry, right? Where you're just kind of planting the same thing over and over again. It's really common, right, when you're looking for crops. But when we see a forest ecosystem, monocultures aren't that great. So a monoculture essentially is just a single species cut and dry in a landscape. So just a whole field of one particular species.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and so the next one that also forms a monoculture is buckthorn. And so it's also kind of a woody shrub, and there are two main varieties that we see that are problematic. So common buckthorn and glossy buckthorn, which again has really tasty seeds for birds and wildlife. And so it spreads throughout forests. And they also have these thorns at the end of each twig, which is kind of painful if you're ever coming across it in the wild. And again, it forms those dense monocultures, which really robs an area of its biodiversity.
Okay.
And so kind of the next one we have, which a lot of people might be more familiar with because there are a lot of garlic mustard pulls, is garlic mustard. And so one key thing to know about garlic mustard is that the first year it kind of stays lower to the ground and forms these heart-shaped rosettes that are actually kind of pretty when you look at them. And then the second year it actually just spikes up, similar to mullein actually. And so it grows to about 1 to 3 feet tall and then flowers. Originally it was brought over by settlers who thought it tasted good, and then it kind of got out of control. But again, it's typically spreading via seeds, and it also utilizes allelopathy. So it's poisoning the soil around it so that it has a little bit of a leg up on the competition, and forms these dense monocultures, right? There's kind of a common thread with invasives.
Yeah, it kind of seems like sometimes we talk, they're all different species and have these cool, unique adaptations, but it's here's that monoculture word again, or that allelopathy word again for a different species, but same issue.
Right, because realistically, it probably wouldn't be that horrible if it wasn't forming a monoculture, right? If there were just pockets of them here or there, it wouldn't be so bad. But yeah, and so kind of moving on, we have Japanese barberry, which we've talked a little bit about. So a 2 to 8 foot tall spiny shrub. And one of the great things about barberry is that it has so many different leaf patterns and variation in the leaves, but still not that great overall if you've ever had to work with it. It is one of the most painful plants because it has these little spines that are like hypodermic needles. which a lot of animals don't like moving through either. So when you see it in a forest and you see these dense, again, monocultures of Japanese barberry, it's really harmful for the wildlife in that area. It also can create this perfect microclimate for ticks, which I think none of us love. If you joined us, I think last week for our talk on ticks, you know just how icky they can be. And we shouldn't encourage their growth anywhere from my perspective, except for possums. Possums are good. Yeah. But, and so it again causes that ecological harm and then some human harm because as we're thinking about eradicating it and trying to pull it out, that is not enjoyable for anyone. And also it's caused by humans.
Gotcha.
Generally.
Yeah, okay.
And yeah, and so next we talk about Japanese knotweed, which, right, the more fun one. So it's crazy, like even just reading about it, it has such an extensive underground root system, it uses fragmentation, it gets huge and just so powerful. I know when I was reading about it, you can see that all three major categories of harm are covered by this. I know in some places, homeowners have to check boxes before they sell their house saying if they have Japanese knotweed, because some people will not buy their house or they can't get loans because they have this on their property, because it can just absolutely wreck the flooring, the foundation. It's horrifying.
It is, I have lived at a house that had Japanese knotweed into the foundation, and it is absolutely insane what it can do to a block of solid concrete that made it through a ton of Michigan winters and who knows what else. And along comes this incredibly strong plant ready to take it on.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of beautiful on its own standing, but when you think of all of the implications of having it in an area, it's a little much.
Right.
Yeah. And so this last one that we're going to talk about is wild parsnip, which isn't quite as common as the other five, but it is worth mentioning and worth talking about because it can grow up to 6 inches high in the rosette stage and 4 feet when it's flowering, which is pretty big. Again, it uses seeds, birds and wildlife and humans as its vectors for spreading, and can form these dense monocultures. But one of the biggest things is if you brush up against it or you break it at all, what can end up happening is you can get a rash that is photosensitive. So when exposed to light, it can cause burning and pain and harm. So a lot of people, I think, have heard about it through that because when you're out hiking, you kind of want to be out in the sun. I think most of us don't like hiking on horrifying rainy thunderstorm days. And so if you brush up against it and you suddenly have this horrifying rash, it can ruin your whole day. It can ruin a lot of things, really. But it was originally, there's some use for it because it has edible roots, right? So not all bad, but really not good. And especially when we're thinking from a management perspective, you can't just go pull it like you would some other things.
Right, and seems it's always interesting on this one to me of the whole editable roots thing, but the potential for the rash, just I'll go to a lot of effort for a tasty meal, but I'm not sure I would ever have wanted to have to deal with harvesting those roots.
Yeah, not for the faint of heart, for sure. But
right.
It is, it's in the same family as carrots and Queen Anne's lace, so it kind of makes sense, maybe, a little bit. Someone thought it was a carrot and didn't die from that. I don't know.
Right, yeah. Okay.
And so when we're thinking about how we can apply it, again, decontamination is one of the biggest things that we can do. It's incredibly important, and I think that we don't do it enough. And maybe we can start a decontamination challenge, right? You know, like show everyone cleaning off their gear, but who knows? And then choosing those non-invasive species when gardening. So keeping an eye out for what is invasive in your particular area, because anyone who's tuning in from outside of Michigan, you might have very different needs based on where you're tuning in from. So just kind of keeping that in mind and watching for any of those invasives when you're out hiking, because again, you don't want to be carrying them anywhere, but you also kind of want to be aware of what's in an area and maybe see if you can spot any of those monocultures. Okay. So is there anything that you guys are going to be looking for when you're out hiking this summer?
I haven't actually, and I hope I don't run into it, but I haven't seen wild parsnip out in the wild. I know folks who have seen it, but it's a plant that I would want to view from afar just to kind of see what it does. It's one that I haven't come across on my own, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And much the better for it.
Yeah. I'm totally good with it, but it is always interesting around invasives of, it's like, oh, I'd be interesting to actually see this plant in real life or this animal in real life, but I also hope I never do, because I hope we can contain it or eradicate it. So yeah.
Okay, so when we're thinking about the activity for this week, there are a couple of different things to do depending on your level of wanting to get out. So there are these really great trainings that are available through the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, I think is the acronym, which allow you to do invasive species identification quizzes, and they're actually a lot of fun and really informative. And so I think Chris can drop that in the chat if you're curious about that link at all. And they have a wide variety of invasives, so not just the forest species that we were talking about, they also have aquatic species, so like purple loosestrife, Phragmites, and then some of like the animals like mussels that you might be curious about if you love the water resources, which I think we're going to be talking about a lot more in May, so stay tuned for those. And then if you do want to get outside, go and look for some invasives in your own backyard or neighborhood. I'm sure that you're bound to see one if you think of what you're looking for. And so when you are looking for these, you can think of some questions like, how did they end up there? If you're in the middle of a beautiful old growth forest, how are you finding buckthorn maybe? Or how did barberry just happen to land in this one particular patch? Do you think that they started out as ornamentals? Do you think that someone was using them for food? Just kind of think about why they're there as opposed to just how awful it is to have them there.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of good way to think about it. It's particularly with invasives, it can be overwhelming, and a lot of us work in it day to day, and it is hard sometimes to swallow. But it is they're cool plants at the end of the day, and kind of thinking a little bit more deeply about them, I think, is a great suggestion.
Yeah,
cool. Well, thanks for the suggestions, Jen. If you're looking for other ways to get outside, be sure to check out the Stay Connected to Nature page at huronpines.org. That wraps up today's content. We really appreciate everyone joining us today. I have just a few wrap-up items, and then we have time for questions. I see lots of great things popping up in the chat. So as part of our efforts to understand how we can continue to improve our education programming, we'd appreciate just a couple of minutes of your time to fill out an evaluation survey. Chris is putting that link into the chat box. We do have an overview document that highlights the primary information covered, as well as some of the additional resources that we've mentioned and some additional information. Those are going to be sent out to anyone that pre-registered with Chris. If you didn't pre-register, email him, chris@huronpines.org, and he'll be sure to get you that information. And finally, we're excited to say that you can join us every Thursday in May at 1 p.m., same time, same place. You'll get to see other faces from our staff alongside Jen, so get excited. I know we're all excited. That full schedule is available now on our events page at huronpines.org/events. You can also add these to your personal calendars via a button on our events page, or if you'd like to get weekly reminders, Chris is sending those out via email. Okay, Jen, lots of questions coming in here. So I'm gonna start out with a question we talked about goats and sheep as a possible management tool. Do they pass the seed on? Do you know what is the sort of research or conversation around that question?
I'm not actually sure. I think it would really depend. One of the biggest things though with sheep is they're not looking just for the berries or the fruits. They're eating the whole plant down to the roots. And so hopefully you're getting a lot of the times the ones that you're going to be using, I think sheep and goats as controls for, aren't necessarily going to be in the fruit producing stage at that point, so you won't have to worry quite so much about seed. Other than that, I'm not 100% sure, I guess. Like if they did happen to eat them, if it would survive going through their GI tract. But I want to say that for the most part, it wouldn't be as much of an issue, just for the fact that that's not what they're going for, right? Because birds are actively eating the seeds and the fruits, and then it goes through them. Whereas sheep are like, all right, give me some stem, give me some leaf, like let's go. What can I eat? So
okay, cool. So I do want to honor that it is 1:30. Jen and I can stay on. We see lots of other questions and thoughts that we're going to share out with the group. But if you've got to jump off, we really appreciate you joining us. We've loved hanging out with you for the month of April, and are excited to hopefully continue seeing some of you on Thursdays in May. So Jen, we've got some questions around folks using garlic mustard. So it is edible, and like you mentioned, it was brought over as a food source. Is it, I guess maybe can we speak a little bit to the uses of invasive species and what that might look like?
Yeah, well, like especially with garlic mustard, right? It is such a good food source, and it does taste garlicky, right? So it is a great substitution, and especially as we're thinking about how we can use more wild plants in our foods, in our restaurants. I think it's really great because it does seem like such a waste, right? To absolutely destroy and eradicate this, and you see buckets and buckets and buckets of dead plants when they could be going and helping with some of that, a little bit of food scarcity issues, right?
Yeah.
Not always the best one, but it is a potential food source, and I think that it's good if we can treat it like that and then actively get people engaged, as opposed to just, okay, we're pulling out all this garlic mustard. It's like, okay, we're pulling out all this garlic mustard to take to a local business and use it.
Right. Yeah, cool. Yeah, and I think that, I think about those restaurants that are using it, and I would encourage everyone listening, if you go to a restaurant, well, when it is safe and restaurants are open, and if you're going to a restaurant that's using it, I sit here in my education head and I'm like, oh, that would be, if you see that and it's like, oh, hey, restaurant, are you educating your customers that they're eating an invasive species and that you're making use of it, but at the end, we're really actually trying to get this off our landscape. It's a great opportunity for that conversation.
Right. Well, and too, with that, it's putting less stress on native plant populations too when out foraging, right? Because if you can choose an invasive species and be like, okay, we're going to use as much of that as possible, then that means you're not potentially using as much of a native plant that might be under a little bit more stress in the wild.
Yeah, I think about wild leeks as we head into leek season, and some of the stress caused to that. So yeah, it's a great point, Jen. Yeah. We've got a question sort of about what do invasive species look like in other countries or on other continents? We have invasive species that have come from both Europe and Asia. Are we sending invasive species out their way? Or I know that I can't speak to that at all.
I'm not too sure, I guess. I would assume so, right? Because theoretically, we do have some aggressive natives for sure here in the Americas. But I think while not all areas will provide ideal conditions for some of the invasives that we see to spread, a lot of areas beyond ourselves, other countries do have issues with invasives. But again, I think a lot of it is a case-by-case basis. Right. So anything that utilizes allelopathy can potentially be harmful. Right. So whether that is a native species or whether that is an invasive, like what we see, those do always have the potential to cause harm. Right. But I can't necessarily speak to any specifics. I haven't studied too much European botany strictly. I haven't heard about it, I guess, as much in the Amazon, but I can't speak to that so much, so I'm sorry.
No, and maybe we can put our hands on resources to add to the take-home page and share it with you guys. Right. So we do have, and again, I'm going to lean on Jen as our botany person here, of sort of this idea of allelopathy, and it's happening in our native species. Do you know sort of, is it more common in invasive species, or is it that our natives, the percent of our natives doing it is the same and just different, or what does that look like?
So again, right, the benefits of allelopathy from a plant standpoint are the fact that it provides a better environment for it, right? It provides a better environment for that specific species to spread. So theoretically, right, we can have it in our native species. We just probably wouldn't see it so much because we'd be like, oh, it's a field of wild, you know, blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
Another thing though is scientists haven't been able to study extensively every plant, and so allelopathy in and of itself is a relatively new area of study, and so a lot of the focus has been on invasive species, especially in countries that have the resources to study it extensively. So that's why we see a lot of times like spotted knapweed or garlic mustard, which are two huge invasive species, being studied for that.
Okay.
So I think there is potential because plants do have different strategies of how they deal with soil. Like all of the members of the pea family pretty much can work with nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they have a very special relationship and can actually help with soil nitrogen levels. So I think potentially we can see that with our native species, but less so generally.
Okay, gotcha. We've got a question on the sort of the word naturalized. So for several years, the question is, wouldn't a species be considered naturalized? Like, is there a point at which an invasive is just considered part of the local habitat? Can you speak to that sort of differentiation a little bit more?
Yeah, so that's always kind of like a hard line, I think, to draw. But essentially what it usually comes down to is it causing harm, right? It comes back to that initial definition of an invasive. Is it harmful to either the overall ecology? Is it harmful to the economy? Or is it harmful to humans? And so I think that's what keeps a lot of invasive species from just being considered naturalized. Because, right, we do have a lot of species that are naturalized and non-native, dandelions, for example. Well, it depends, I guess, on where you are again.
Right.
But so if it's causing harm, then I don't know if it could ever truly be considered naturalized unless the entire ecology shifted to support that plant, right? If everything became skewed in favor of that to such an extent that it was just like, oh, yes, this is what the area is now. I think at that point an invasive could potentially become naturalized, but generally that's not something that we would see quite so readily.
Okay, gotcha. And this is sort of bringing up this question of like, just generally like when a plant becomes naturalized, so the plants that we, you know, non-native, but maybe not causing the harm. So we've gotten to the point in the conservation community or botany community where we call them naturalized. What does that look like in terms of the support that those naturalized plants are providing in terms of wildlife or, you know, soil support or whatever? What does that sort of thing look like?
So usually they just create their own relationships with a lot of those native flora and fauna. So they might produce delicious berries that are really, really helpful for wintering populations, maybe, or things like that, or they provide a new source of food potentially in the winter or the spring or the summer for different species. Okay. So they find their own ways to form relationships with the surrounding communities.
Okay, gotcha. And we do have folks letting us know, just in case you're seeing the chat, that we do have some. I struggle with allelopathic all the time. Allelopathic natives like black walnuts and goldenrods and sumac. So thanks to all our fellow plant people that are chiming in there. That's really helpful information. So, well, I don't see any other questions coming in at this point. Again, Jen and I can hang out for a few more minutes in case anything else comes in. You've seen a couple of resources come across the chat. We will be putting those into our take-home sheet. Make sure to email Chris if you need that. Please do fill out our evaluation. We're using it to sort of adjust on the fly and also determine, you know, sort of some great programs that we can offer. So everyone have a great rest of your week, and we hope to see you next Thursday.